Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking something pretty intense, a highly alarming data-driven intelligence assessment of the United States from June of 2026. Now, this isn't based on opinions or sentiment. We are looking at a rigorous macro-structural document that relies entirely on hard, physical, financial, and legal ledger data to basically quantify the structural integrity of the state. So let's dive right in and see exactly what the data is telling us.
The core thesis of this whole document? It's starkly mathematical. It suggests that this crazy, unprecedented convergence of military, economic, and domestic stressors has pushed the state's structural integrity to its absolute limit. It paints a picture of a nation caught in a terminal feedback loop of systemic fragility, where geopolitical actions and domestic realities are just colliding in real time.
To understand how these cascading failures interact, we're going to systematically walk through the report's 5 primary domains: geopolitical shocks and supply paralysis, the macroeconomic reality gap, institutional purges and data blindness, historic domestic societal fracturing, and demographic stratification of collapse.
Starting with Section 1, geopolitical shocks and supply paralysis. Basically, the triggers of this whole cascade. Okay, so the assessment traces the beginning of this acute phase to late February 2026, and it was driven entirely by kinetic executive actions abroad and the massive retaliations they provoked. By bypassing legislative debate, the unilateral authorization of Operation Epic Fury unleashed 900 sorties against Iranian targets. And yeah, it successfully achieved its immediate tactical goal of decapitating leadership, but it instantly triggered a catastrophic maritime blockade by the IRGC. Overnight, a military operation transformed into a global logistics crisis.
The sheer volume of the problem here is honestly staggering. This blockade effectively trapped massive amounts of hydrocarbons in the Persian Gulf. And because existing overland bypass pipelines simply don't have the capacity to make up the difference, this closure created a net global supply deficit of up to 16.5 million barrels per day. The logistical devastation rippled through the global economy in literally a matter of hours.
And man, did that global shock hit home fast. That localized supply deficit translated instantly to domestic economic paralysis. We're talking retail gas jumping to $3.98 and diesel reaching a crippling $5.37 per gallon. But it's not just fuel. Because the Persian Gulf produces 30% of the world's seaborne ammonia and urea, U.S. agricultural input prices spiked by 28%. This practically guaranteed extreme stagflation through crushing logistics and compounding food inflation. But believe it or not, there's actually an even more existentially threatening issue looming here. China's November 2026 rare earth element export control deadline. Strict extraterritorial licensing means that the production of advanced defense platforms, things like F-35 fighter jets and Virginia-class submarines, will mathematically halt. The U.S. military-industrial complex is fundamentally dependent on these materials, and this regulatory blockade is projected to hit with zero buffer, right when global force projection is heavily deployed.
Moving right along to Section 2, the macroeconomic reality gap, or the mathematical trap.
So, as the physical supply chains are choking out, the report highlights this violent divergence between the domestic economy's true structural health and the official top-line figures the government was presenting. The document exposes the officially touted 2.1% GDP growth as a complete statistical mirage, driven by short-term, debt-financed consumption. When you contrast that directly with sluggish gross domestic income, which plummeted all the way to 0.5% in late 2025, a very different reality emerges. It's a reality of contracting real wealth and deeply negative purchasing power.
Furthermore, this artificial expansion was fueled by a $1.8 trillion deficit, and this triggered something unprecedented, a fiscal inversion. The cost of simply servicing the interest on past national debt actually surpassed the entire national defense budget. Think about that for a second. When a nation is spending more on past debt interest than on current military power or infrastructure, the telemetry assessment warns that it has crossed the terminal threshold.
That magic, or rather tragic, number is $1.22 trillion. With that much capital trapped every single year in debt interest payments, the central bank is mathematically paralyzed. Historically, to fight the kind of supply-driven stagflation we just looked at, a central bank would aggressively hike interest rates. But doing so now? It would cause that $1.22 trillion burden to spiral exponentially, instantly triggering a sovereign debt crisis. Basically, the state is completely boxed in.
Which brings us to Part 3, institutional purges and data blindness. This is all about hollowing out the state.
To keep control of the narrative while stuck in this macroeconomic trap, the data indicates the executive branch intentionally crippled its own statistical agencies. The assessment uses this fascinating medical term for it, anosognosia. In this context, elite anosognosia describes a profound macroeconomic detachment where the state actively destroys its own statistical sensory organs, purposely generating pristine, optimistic reports of economic health derived from totally broken data feeds just to maintain a veneer of stability.
And listen, this institutional blindness didn't just happen by accident. By using the Schedule F employment classification, fundamental civil service protections were stripped from about 162,000 career employees. This massive purge starved agencies, like the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Completely bereft of personnel and funding, they abandoned field data collection entirely. They literally started inventing artificial placeholders, like logging a 0.0% change in rental costs for a whole month, just to artificially drag down official inflation metrics. So now they're relying entirely on algorithms that assume normal conditions during a period of extreme abnormality.
Section 4. Historic domestic societal fracturing. Let's look at the physical manifestation of all this systemic friction.
See, the public was out there trying to survive the brutal physical reality of $5.37 diesel and negative real income, so they violently rejected the state's manipulated statistical illusions. This profound narrative dissonance is what culminated in the decentralized No Kings mobilization on March 28, 2026. We're talking 8 to 9 million people, roughly 2.3% of the entire U.S. population, protesting executive overreach and the exploding cost of living across all 50 states. It was a massive physical rejection of the elite consensus.
At the same time, this economic frustration escalated into systemic logistical disruption. Organized labor realized that legislative gridlock prevented any meaningful cost of living relief, so they heavily leveraged coordinated strikes in healthcare and logistics. For example, over 100,000 workers struck in Minnesota alone, forcing massive regional closures. They utilized targeted strikes and boycotts to explicitly bottleneck the physical supply chain and completely paralyze domestic velocity.
Finally, Section 5, Demographic Stratification of Collapse. Why this is a highly unequal crisis.
This part is absolutely crucial because it reveals a terrifying systemic asymmetry. The collapse of institutional legitimacy isn't hitting everyone the same way. It's radically stratified by education. For working classes with a high school diploma or less, they're absorbing the totally unshielded physical impacts of the inflation tax. Those with some college, they're utilizing offshore crypto to escape domestic banking altogether. The bachelor's degree cohort is out there driving a massive $400 billion stablecoin shift and aggressively weaponizing the legal system against the state. And then you have the postgraduate elite, largely shielded and decoupled via AI, capturing debt yield, but even they remain inescapably vulnerable to that rare earth blockade we talked about earlier. So that brings us to a really stark concluding reality. As late June 2026 approaches, the telemetry projects that without immediate diplomatic resolutions to reopen the Persian Gulf, a massive restructuring of the federal debt matrix, and some literal technological miracles in domestic rare earth processing, there is virtually zero mathematical probability of a return to baseline stability. So I'll leave you with this to think about. When a sovereign system is caught in a multiplex of compounding crises from every possible angle, can it realistically engineer a soft landing, or has the math already decided the outcome?